Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland and here I am in the Slave House, Cape Town, this exhibition about apartheid. So apartheid officially began in 1948 and it ended when Nelson Mandela became president in 1994, but some of the racially discriminatory legislation dates back to prior to 1948. So obviously there have been white people of Dutch stock in South Africa since 1652 and whites came out from other places like Ireland, Great Britain, Portugal, in the 20th century, sort of Italy, Greece, Jewish people from what's now Poland, Lithuania, and so forth. In the white world, there were supremacist assumptions at the height of imperialism, because the white world, like Europe and North America, was technologically, scientifically advanced. And then some whites wrongly thought that whites were automatically better at governance, more intelligent. Of course, that's not true. You look back far enough, India and China or even Araby were well ahead of the white world. It's not even clear who's white and who's not. I realise racial differences are just skin deep, but simple-minded people don't see it that way. But anyway, so whites took the lion's share of all the good things, monopolised political power. Now, in the 19th century, very few black people and coloured people in South Africa had the right to vote. By the 1950s, we completely stripped of them. So the ANC, African National Congress, formed in 1912 in Bloemfontein. There's of course the Indian National Conference, set up in British India with the blessing of the Raj to provide critical analysis of the British superintendents of India, but it gradually became more oppositional. But the Indian National Congress was an inspiration to the African National Congress. So the ANC, they disliked the way that black people got very little education. Most black people were illiterate at the time. The budget accorded to schools for black children was very, very low, though actual interracial mixed-race education wasn't actually illegal, but in practice it very, very seldom happened. Nelson Mandela indeed intended Witwatersrand, one of the top universities in South Africa, in the 1940s. There were very, very few black students at the time, but it wasn't illegal. It became illegal after 1948. But so the ANC, they asked politely for their rights for decades. The government refused to concede anything, wouldn't even hold meetings with them, outlawed strikes and so on. It got worse and worse after 1948. The Group Areas Act designating areas for black people or white people or Asians or coloured people. And of course, most of the land, the nicest land at that, was for whites. The Job Reservation Act, so there were almost no decently paid jobs for black people and so forth. So strikes, peaceful protests didn't work, and the ANC indeed was outlawed. The Suppression of Communists Act was used against them, and indeed many people like Mandela were dual members of the South African Communist Party as well as the ANC. Now communism is very, very bad. When Mandela joined the Communist Party, Stalin was the big daddy of world communism, one of the most prolific mass murderers of all time. He ran an extremely bloodthirsty and cruel regime. And that is to the great discredit of Nelson Mandela and the ANC. They were involved in that. And it's partly because they were also communists that really put off people who might have otherwise been open to persuasion, which is not impliedly saying apartheid was good. It definitely wasn't. It was bad, very bad. I'm glad it's gone. But they didn't help themselves, a big strategic error. They might say, well, the Soviet Union was at least willing to help, but most Western countries were not. But anyway, by the 1980s, they had the ANC, you can see the ANC flag down there, formed the United Democratic Front with all sorts of anti-apartheid organisations, trades unions, conscription, white boys conscripted into the military up until about 1990. So black, green and gold, the colours of the ANC. The ANC is for black people initially only, eventually they adopted the Freedom Charter, a non-racial South Africa, that citizenship would be offered to South Africans of all races, and there'd be complete racial equality, and so on. And just because whites are discriminating against black people, it didn't mean that black people were going to discriminate against whites. But anyway, so the Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, started fighting from 1961 onwards. Bombs designed just to damage property, not kill people. It never went wrong and killed people occasionally. There was the Sharpeville massacre. There's protests against the pass laws, when thousands of people went outside the police station, challenged the police to arrest them because they were walking around without a pass. So it became kind of militarized. The police had to operate as a quasi-army and didn't deal with ordinary crime in black areas. Were really there just as enforcers for apartheid, but increasing state violence. You see these mass funerals. So obviously, several thousand people killed by the security forces during the apartheid struggle. Umkhonto we Sizwe didn't manage to kill that many people in South Africa, some civilians, some whites, some black civilians, not that many members of the security forces, but MK, as it's known for short, was active elsewhere in Angola. Of course, in the 1960s, Britain decolonized almost all its colonies in Africa, became independent. Some of them provided bases for MK, for the ANC. The ANC had an office in Lusaka, Zambia, formerly Northern Rhodesia, and so on. So an international campaign, and some white undergraduates were deeply sympathetic. You see them protesting here and helping young men to evade conscription. Black men could join the army if they wanted to, but why would they do so? To uphold the system, to oppress them? Some people are just apolitical, people are just desperate poverty, joined as the only way to guarantee 3 meals a day, and so on. So an awful lot of deaths in custody, and you see deaths out of custody, and all sorts of people killed by the police, and the police here announcing the person slipped over and hit his head in the shower, an excuse given with extraordinary regularity. So police brutality was not uncommon at the time, but particularly against young black men. If you're a middle-class, middle-aged white woman, I think you're pretty safe, and so on. And there you see a police officer and the South African flag at the time, orange at the top, white in the middle bar, and then that blue at the bottom with the British flag, the flag of the old Transvaal Republic and Orange Free State in the middle. That was abolished after racial equality came in 1994. So anyway, a worldwide anti-apartheid campaign of disinvestment, of boycotts, sanctions, of not playing sports. It was all started when Basil D'Oliveira, a mixed-race South African, he couldn't play first-class cricket in this country, so he moved to the United Kingdom. He became a British citizen, was selected for England, and was due to play for the South African team in 1970. The South Africans said to the England-Wales Cricket Board, please don't put him on the team, and they were going to acquiesce and not do so. So Peter Hain, a white who'd grown up in South Africa, actually born in Kenya, he was part of this, the Fair Cricket Council, saying, you can't have South Africa determining the composition of the team of England and Wales, and no racism in sport. Boycott the Springboks, the South African rugby team, disrupting matches in Scotland, in England, probably Wales too. In Ireland, matches went on for a little while. In New Zealand, the 1980 Springboks tore apart families. Some people just want their sport, don't care about politics. So to this day, I know people in the UK who don't realise that most South African people are black, because in Europe, those South African people who lead are white in 95% of cases. Anyway, so here's another hero of the anti-apartheid movement, Steve Biko, totally reasonable guy. See the film about him, Cry Freedom, a medical student and part of the black consciousness movement. And obviously he was demonized by the apartheid government as being some dangerous revolutionary. He wasn't at all, totally reasonable person. And one of his lecturers was the former headmaster of Eton, a rather conservative figure, who said that Biko was, completely mannerly, intelligent, cultured, totally unthreatening. He just wanted equality and didn't advocate the use of physical force. Nevertheless, he was arrested and beaten to death in Pretoria Central Prison. And so that really just was grist to the mill and says we have to use force against the brutality of apartheid and so on. Here you see a bit of the Bantu Education Act, and there's Dr. Hendrik French Verwoerd. He was actually born in the Netherlands, who came here when he was 1 year old, just after the Second South African War, but completely embraced the Afrikaner cause, spoke flawless English, which was very unusual for his generation. So he was a highly intelligent person and evil. And fascinatingly, his doctoral thesis was the numbing of emotion, where he managed to neutralize his own feelings. And he talked long and loud about the iniquities of the British during the Second South African War and the suffering of his own Afrikaner people, but then had this moral blind spot towards the depredations of whites against black people in South Africa and the terrible suffering of many black people that he personally perpetrated. And here we have his Bantu Education Act, which was really very much limiting education, reducing the budget so low that the education of black people scarcely functioned, because he wanted to keep them in ignorance, realizing knowledge is power, to make them dependent upon whites. And so we go on. So fascinating exhibition. And here is an ANC poster from the 1994 election. Nelson Mandela welcoming children of all races. And here are the platforms of the various political parties. So the National Party embraced democracy. Perhaps surprisingly, by this stage, one of their candidates was black. But there was the Azanian People's Congress, who wanted whites out. the Afrikaner Volksfront, who sort of rejected democracy, wanted a separate land for the Afrikaner people, who were no more than 8% of the population, and so on, various communist groups. But there's a lot here about white anti-apartheid activists. I mean, not all whites were pro-apartheid, but let me be frank, until the 1990s, most were. Some of them were outright racists, and some of them said, okay, democracy is good in principle, but in practice it doesn't work in Africa. South Africa is undemocratic, like almost every other country in Africa. Majority rule has been cataclysmic in so many other African countries. That'll happen here. It happened in Zimbabwe. Within 2 years they had genocide in Matabeleland. So it'll just be civil war, it'll be total societal collapse in Angola and Mozambique. But anyway, sanctions and so on, and negotiations led to complete democracy, and it really wasn't that bad. And of course, apartheid was a disaster every single day for the black majority in South Africa, as well as for other racial groups like coloured people and Asians, and mostly of Indian stock. So that's a little bit about the apartheid regime. People often defied it, going around without their passes. Winnie Mandela was not allowed to live in Soweto. She did so anyway, but the apartheid government didn't dare arrest her in the 1980s. And look at all these sites, only whites. So I could have been born black, I'd be the same person. How would I feel? It is humiliating, it's degrading, it's taking away my freedom of movement, it's limiting my educational and career opportunities. That's unjust, that's illogical, and I demand change, would want to assert my rights. Anyway, thank you for watching my video. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon, donate on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Toodaloo.